down in Washington, D.C. with my husband and a 2-year-old and 4-year-old as a protest against the war and having to run away from tear gas with our children. I recall the joy when the war was over, taking the kids, going together with many friends from an alternative school and taking the kids to New York City where the celebration to end the war, because the war had ended, was so joyous, with Phil Oak singing and I think Joan Baez singing and people dancing and just a wonderful, wonderful spirit that finally we were out of a war. I wish we were out of all wars now.
Patty, you clearly recall the joy of that day, the war ending. To be in Central Park in New York was joyful. What did you think then, or what do you think now about the suffering that we're hearing of the Vietnamese who were left behind? It was not a joyful moment for many of them.
I think they didn't have a very joyful time with foreign invaders in their country either. And I know there were certainly differences and people coming from many different angles and the thousands of young Americans that got killed too.
Yeah.
It's not a good part of our history. And the sad thing is that so much of the time since then we've been at war as well.
True.
And I'm proud to say that my children and grandchildren and husband and I still have protested against the current wars.
There have been plenty. Patty, I appreciate your call. Janice in Greenville, South Carolina. Janice, you're on the air.
Hi, Tom. I just wanted to share some of the insights that I had. My ex-husband, when he came back from Vietnam, we were together. He was 19 years old. And when he left Vietnam, they told him not to wear their uniform, to travel in civilian clothes because there was so much opposition to the war. So he didn't come back as a hero. He came back afraid to tell anybody he had fought in the Vietnam War. His best friend, who was a medic, was killed on the battlefield, and he had to carry him out into the place to leave him. And those things had such far-reaching and tragic effects on his life. As a Marine, he was sprayed with Agent Orange and wound up with Hodgkin's lymphoma in later life. So there were so many things that people go through and continue to go through, their families suffer. And the fall of Vietnam in 1975, I'll never forget, he was watching TV and he put his head in his hand and just sobbed and said that it was all for nothing.
Janice, I'm sorry for that memory, but I appreciate your call very much. Your husband, who suffered from the effects of Agent Orange, later 12 million gallons of that sprayed by the U.S., over 10% of South Vietnam in the decade ending 1971. 2 to 4 million Vietnamese exposed, more than 2 million U.S. service members exposed. David Greenway, Viet Thanh Nguyen, I want to think about lessons from. We can look at that day endlessly. The drama of it was so high, but it ended a large engagement, a large and deeply divisive war. David, when you look back on all of that now, what lessons do you draw? And has the country drawn them? Is it evident that we all imagined we would draw deep, profound, unending lessons from the Vietnam War? Did we?
Well, I remember talking to General Dempsey at Baghdad 10 years ago. He's now chairman of the Joint Chiefs, but then he was in charge of training the Iraqi army, and he and his staff told me that you can train and equip an army, but you can't motivate it. That's up to the Iraqis themselves.
And at that time in Baghdad, he's talking about the Iraqi army.
The Iraqi army, which again collapsed, much the way the South Vietnamese army did.
In the face of Islamic State onslaught.
And I think that to try to instill American values by means of intervention and military occupation just doesn't work out and has not served us well.
What does that mean? Does it mean stay home? Because Americans are exhorted to go abroad and go to war with, as our callers are pointing out one after another, with notable frequency.
Well, I think that if it's deemed necessary that the nation go to war, then we have to be very careful about how we do it. I think the best example was George Herbert Walker Bush in the first Gulf War, where we got in and got out, accomplished the mission,
Iraq had invaded Kuwait, go in, boot them out of Kuwait, and be done.
Yes.
In a matter of 30, 40 days.
Yes, and not spend 10 years trying to occupy Iraq.
We're talking about the fall of Saigon and its long residence. I'm Tom Ashbrook. This is On Point. Viet Thanh Nguyen, I'm curious, when you think of lessons of the fall of Saigon, the end of the war, the entire war, as a Vietnamese American, what lessons stand up to you? They might be quite different.
Well, I think that there's been a failure to imagine creatively. And, as David said, we haven't learned the conventional military lessons. We haven't learned the conventional strategic lessons about why we should get involved in foreign countries. And I think that means that we haven't thought enough about how it is that we could actually do things differently if we want to encourage democracy, or if we want to help people think better of America. Maybe we should try peaceful means instead of military means, or instead of inserting ourselves into foreign countries. Because what happened in Vietnam was the United States went in, told the Vietnamese how to fight the war in a particular way, boosted the economy with enormous amounts of money, and what that ultimately led to was the corruption of South Vietnam, and the corruption of the military, corruption of the political leadership, and the terrible end of the war. And that's, I think, something similar happened in Iraq and Afghanistan. Then lastly, as a Vietnamese person who's a refugee and came to the United States, I think that the United States has not learned a fundamental lesson, which is that you cannot look at people in other places from an American-centric point of view. That is partially what brought the U.S. to Vietnam, ignoring Vietnamese viewpoints and imposing American ones. And again, I think that's exactly what we're doing in Iraq and Afghanistan today.
When you go back to Vietnam, you have gone back. What do you see? How do you feel?
Oh, I feel tormented, because many of my relatives are still there, and many of them are still poor, so it's an emotionally difficult thing for me. And then I also see, I'm also very sad because this horrible war was fought, so many people died, and in the end, we ended up with a Vietnam that is exactly something the Americans would have loved, which is a Vietnam that has completely turned itself over to capitalism and is turning into an American strategic ally in the conflict with China. And I think what would happen if the United States had simply left Vietnam alone and spared all the cost of blood and treasure, we might have ended up with exactly the same situation, but without all those lost lives.
Without all that loss. David, take us to that last day again. Viet was 4 years old. You were fully in the midst of a career as a journalist.
I was almost 40.
Yeah. And when did you get on the chopper that took you out? Where was that? What did you see as you left? What were you thinking?
Well, I left around dusk, and as the helicopter...
On the 29th. It would be the next morning before the last choppers went out, I guess.
And I could see ammunition dumps blowing up to the north.
Were the North Vietnamese troops in the city or on the outskirts?
They were on the outskirts, at some distance, but there were explosions at that time going off. I could see the crowds of people milling through the streets of Saigon trying to get onto boats. And this vivid impression of, as the helicopter landed on the Navy ships, of these hundreds and hundreds of little boats, overcrowded boats,
bobbing around
in the ocean, as if they were the flotsam and jetsam of some terrible shipwreck, which in one sense they were.
Yes.
And I think in my notebook, I had jotted down that poem by James Russell Lowell that's above the graves of the British killed at Concord.
From the Revolutionary War.
From the Revolutionary War, he wrote, "They came 3,000 miles and died to keep the past upon the throne."
And there he was talking about redcoats resisting the American Revolution.
Yeah.
Your thought then?
I say, my goodness, we may have been the redcoats.
10,000 miles instead of 3 to Vietnam.
10,000 miles instead of 3, yeah.
The past did not stay upon its throne. I mean, the colonial era ended.
Exactly. And I remember Raja Ratnam, the Prime Minister, the Foreign Minister of Singapore, a great friend of the United States, said that the fall of Saigon marked the end of the colonial era in Southeast Asia, the effective and symbolic end of 4 centuries of Western political and military intervention in the region. And this is coming from a friend of the United States.
Viet Thanh Nguyen, you remind us that in your Vietnamese American circles, this is called it's called Black April, I guess, for the sorrow of the suffering that came with the end of the war.
Absolutely. This is a very important anniversary for many of the Southern Vietnamese in the United States. And for them, their history, the way they look back on the war is that they lost their country. They lost many family members. They lost property and health and peace of mind. And so it's important for them to commemorate this event from a Vietnamese point of view because they feel they've been overlooked on the American side, and it is a dark time for them.
Will they go back? Do they go back? Repatriate, or are most Vietnamese American forever now?
They're Vietnamese Americans. They're proud to be Americans, but many of them choose to go back. Either people from that generation or even people of my generation, they go back because they miss their country or they have relatives. Or for the younger generation, they see economic and cultural opportunities in a capitalist Vietnam that many of them can't find here.
40 years later, what an irony. Viet Thanh Nguyen, author of The Sympathizer, thank you so much for being with us from LA today.
Thanks for having me.
And HTS, David Greenway, author of Foreign Correspondent. David, thank you as always.
Thank you.
Smokey Robinson of the Miracles, Track of My Tears. I'm Tom Ashbrook. Thanks for joining us. This is On Point.
On Point is a production of WBUR Boston and NPR.
Support for On Point comes from WBUR Boston, Arizona State University, with more than 70 campus degrees to choose from, offered 100% online with 6 start dates a year. Learn more at online.asu.edu. And the financial services firm of Raymond James, for over 50 years offering wealth management, banking, and capital markets expertise with a focus on putting the client's financial well-being first. Learn more at raymondjames.com.
Thanks for listening to WBFO 88.7 FM, your NPR station. Sunny skies today with highs in the low 60s. Tonight, partly to mostly cloudy, lows in the low 40s. Then for tomorrow, mostly cloudy, a chance of showers in the afternoon with highs in the low 60s once again. Tomorrow night, mostly cloudy, a chance of showers in the evening, lows in the mid-40s. Friday, mostly cloudy in the morning, then becoming partly sunny in the afternoon with highs in the low 60s Friday. For the weekend, Saturday and Sunday, mostly sunny skies. We'll have highs in the mid to upper 60s. Monday, partly sunny, a chance of showers again, highs about 70. Well, as the warmer weather sneaks in here, we'll learn more about the summer concert lineup at Canalside today. Officials with the Erie Canal Harbor Development Corporation are slated to announce their extended summer concert series later on this afternoon. That series includes the rundown for all of the free Thursday concerts on Buffalo's waterfront, as well as more details of the local Battle of the Bands and Music and Dance series. We'll have a look at local news right after the top of the hour.
This is Mark Wozniak, afternoon program host. Thanks for listening to WBFO Buffalo HD1, WOLN Olean, WUBJ Jamestown, and WNED FM HD2 Buffalo, your NPR station. We are online at WBFO.org.
Funding for Here and Now comes from MathWorks, creators of MATLAB and Simulink software, accelerating the pace of engineering and science. Learn more at mathworks.com.
From NPR and WBUR Boston, I'm Lisa Mullins.
I'm Robin Young. It's Here and Now. Coming up in Baltimore, the Orioles will play today, but in a closed park. How are tensions outside Camden Yards playing out on sports radio?
This literally is unprecedented. We've never had a Major League Baseball game played in front of 0 fans.
Also, 40 years ago, Americans fled Saigon and South Vietnam. We'll speak to a veteran journalist, Jim Laurie, about the day and about what happened next.
And what happened 200 years ago when Indonesia's Tambora volcano erupted.
Disrupted monsoons in Asia, the largest drought in the North American continent in recorded history, season after season of flooding rains across Western Europe.
It also produced Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, as we'll hear here and now.
The news is first.
From NPR News in Washington, I'm Lakshmi Singh. The city of Baltimore will remain under a 10 p.m. to 5 a.m. curfew for several days as a result of riots Monday night following the funeral of a black man who died after he was arrested by police In what may be unprecedented in baseball's 145-year history, the Baltimore Orioles game this afternoon is closed to the public. The unrest in Baltimore was central in Hillary Rodham Clinton's first major policy address since she announced her campaign to seek the Democratic presidential nomination in 2016.
There is something wrong when more than 1 out of every 3 young black men in Baltimore cannot find a job. There is something wrong when trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve breaks down as far as it has in many of our communities.
In a speech at Columbia University today, Clinton outlined proposals to reform the criminal justice system. She also called for the use of body cameras at police departments across the nation. In several recent cases, videos led to investigations in the deaths of black men after they were arrested by police. The United Nations has just launched an appeal for $450 million in relief to millions of people affected by an earthquake and resulting landslides that have claimed more than 5,200 lives in Nepal. From Geneva, Lisa Schlein has more.
The UN appeal will provide life-saving assistance to millions of the survivors over the next 3 months. UN refugee spokeswoman Ariane Rumori says shelter materials are urgently needed.
Many of the estimated 8 million people affected by last Saturday's earthquake and the aftershocks since are living in makeshift camps and open areas in the rain as their homes have been damaged or because they are too afraid to go home amid the continuing aftershocks.
The UN will provide emergency shelter for 500,000 victims. Food will be distributed to 1.25 million people. The injured and sick will receive health care. For NPR News, I'm Lisa Schlein in Geneva.
Lumber Liquidators reveals it's under federal criminal investigation over the source of its laminate floor products. More from NPR's Jim Zaroli.
In early March, Lumber Liquidators was the subject of a 60-minute story alleging that floor products imported from China had excessive levels of the carcinogen formaldehyde. The company has taken issue with the methods used to draw that conclusion. Now the company says it has received a subpoena in connection with a criminal investigation conducted by the U.S. Attorney's Office in Virginia. It also said that the Securities and Exchange Commission has requested it preserve certain information related to the sourcing of the products. The company says it's cooperating with the investigations. Meanwhile, 103 class action suits have been filed since the 60-minute story aired. Jim Zaroli, NPR News, New York.
We should note Lumber Liquidators is a sponsor of NPR programming. Dow is down 77. This is NPR.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include Farmers Insurance, out to educate everybody about common insurance gaps that can be costly so that no one falls victim to them again. Farmers Insurance. Know the gaps. Learn more at farmers.com/inner circle.
It's 4 minutes past noon at WBFO. Good afternoon. I'm Omar Fatou. Officials in the city of Buffalo are keeping close watch on the developments in Baltimore. Mayor Byron Brown addressed the issue on Tuesday. One proactive step, he says, is the appointment of a chief diversity officer at City Hall. Brown says the city and its police department are in a perpetual state of training and readiness.
And yes, we are concerned about what we are seeing and working hard here in Buffalo to have a community where all people see opportunity for themselves and people feel that they are a part of the growth that's taking place in Buffalo and Western New York.
In an effort to remain engaged with his constituents, Brown says he meets monthly with clergy members who help him address community concerns. Local business owners and leaders were invited to a private session in Williamsville this morning to discuss data security. Representatives from agencies, including the FBI and Secret Service, offered information and pointers to help businesses better protect sensitive information, including that of their customers. Peggy Penders, spokesperson for the Better Business Bureau of upstate New York, says a data breach can be especially devastating to small businesses, perhaps enough to put them entirely out of business.
Every business has to be concerned about what they're doing with customers' information, and that can vary depending on what type of business you are. Is it, financial information, just personal information, social security numbers? How are they
they collecting mail? What are they doing with all of it? How safe is it?
Federal officials say threats to security not only come from sources such as overseas hackers, but also domestically, such as hackers trying to gain notoriety or even an employee who is either disgruntled or trying to gain favor by a rival. 48 degrees in Buffalo, it's 12:06 at WBFO.
From NPR and WBUR Boston, I'm Robin Young. And I'm Lisa Mullins, in for Jeremy Hobson. It's Here and Now. We're continuing to follow the latest today in Nepal, where Saturday's earthquake has claimed more than 5,000 lives. Rescue crews are still finding bodies as they dig through the rubble of collapsed homes and buildings. Aid is beginning to trickle into some of the hardest hit areas, the largely rural and mountainous regions of the country that have been cut off by landslides. And in the capital of Kathmandu, people are trying to clean up and figure out just what's next. NPR's Russell Lewis is in Kathmandu now. Russell, you've been traveling around in several parts of the city. What have you been seeing?
Well, it's really a city that's been largely intact, at least in Kathmandu proper. Most of the buildings and homes, they're still standing. There's lots of structural damage. There's broken glass. And, you certainly do see some buildings that are completely destroyed. But, most of the structures were not flattened like we've seen in other earthquakes, such as Haiti in 2010. Today traffic was heavier, cars and buses and motorcycles just zipping around town. And it was a lot heavier today than yesterday. And it was a lot, twice as much probably as the day before. Most of the businesses remain closed. It's either because electricity hasn't been restored or employees are home cleaning up, or perhaps they're too scared to return to work because of the fear of aftershocks.
So what about the supplies that we've been told are so desperately needed in remote areas, even in hospitals in Kathmandu? Food supplies, water supplies, and medical supplies. Are they flowing in yet?
Well, at the moment, it's a lot easier to buy water than food. Supplies are really tight. You can find them if you stop at enough places. Most of the food that I've seen for sale are, things like vegetables and packaged snacks like cookies and crackers. But I did see a pastry shop today that was open and it was packed. One thing that you don't see is panic or fear on the streets. Some of the other disasters that I've covered over the years, you start to see this at about this point, and you really don't see that here. There is concern that if it remains to be difficult to buy the simple things like food and water, that there could be unrest and protests against the Nepali government.
And when you say that there is not a real panic, it's surprising because I think a lot of people are worried about aftershocks. I don't know if you're feeling any aftershocks at this point, are you?
Occasionally. We felt more a couple of days ago. Usually most of the aftershocks, you tend to feel them within the first 3 days of an earthquake, but they could go on for years, as we've seen in Japan after the 2011 earthquake and tsunami there. Some of those aftershocks continue even today.
So the international aid, how well is it being divvied up and distributed?
Well, the government announced today that they've dispersed the equivalent of about $26 million to some of the hardest hit areas. The Ministry of Home Affairs says they've distributed, basically just the essentials, things like rice and sugar and noodles, as well as cooking pots, and of course tents and blankets and clothes and medicine. The need for tents really is one of the biggest thing that we've heard from people here. So many people are living outdoors now, either because their homes are too damaged or they're afraid to be inside for the fear of these aftershocks. And as I said, even though the aftershocks have largely subsided here, there are tens of thousands of people that are sleeping on the streets or in makeshift tent cities that have popped up around Kathmandu. But what you're seeing is, you're largely seeing, enough aid that seems to be flowing in, even though I'm sure the government would like that it's more. You're not hearing complaints from government officials that they're demanding or would like to see more.
And what about the 5,000 who have died? Many of the bodies are being pulled from the rubble. What is happening with them?
Well, some of them are being stored at hospitals in the hopes that family members will come forward to identify and claim them. Others are being burned. We went to a crematorium today on the banks of a nearby river, and it really was a sad sight. Bodies being burned as family members watched the smoke and the ash just wafted skyward. Unfortunately, some of these bodies, though, were apparently unidentified. There was nobody there to watch them. And we're going to continue to see scenes like this for a while. The Prime Minister has said that he expects expects the death toll to top 10,000.
10,000, and with many people still unburied, what are they able to do, government officials, to make sure that disease doesn't spread?
Well, that's actually a common misconception. You hear it a lot after every disaster, but dead bodies actually are not a public health risk. They're not a source of disease. The World Health Organization, the Red Cross, and others all say this. The real threat after a disaster like this is almost always the same. It's contaminated water, it's unsafe food, it's famine, and a lack of proper sanitation facilities.
Finally, Russell, I just wonder what it's been like to look around and to cover this earthquake compared to the other natural disasters that you've covered, and there are many, from Haiti to Japan and others. What are some of the differences that you've noted?
Well, it's always difficult. It's always tough. It's hard to look into the eyes of people. For some of them, they've lost everything in their lives, and they've lost family members, and it's difficult to see that, to know what they're going through, and they just wonder. A place like Nepal was a very poor country, of course, where people don't have a lot of stuff to begin with, and then when you think about losing everything you have, and then try to figure out, what do I do? How do I start over? It's never easy, and it's difficult. They've got a lot of work ahead of them as they try and sort out how they move forward, and it's just it's a huge challenge.
NPR's Russell Lewis in Kathmandu, Nepal. Thank you, Russell. Take care.
You're welcome.
Well, now let's go to this past Saturday's White House Correspondents' Dinner. It brought journalists and entertainment glitterati together for a night of laughs and selfies. The president, a hit, doing stand-up, told jokes, and major broadcast stations responded with red carpet, wall-to-wall coverage. But here's Jon Stewart on The Daily Show.
Unfortunately, here's the problem. Whilst the A-list of America's media political complex fiddled on this Saturday night.
This is the scene in Baltimore, the latest protest over the death of Freddie Gray. Gray died from a mysterious spinal injury while he was in police custody.
The protest did turn violent.
Thousands of protesters stormed the streets.
People that obviously want to have their voices heard.
Yeah, it's not 40 miles from District of Mimosa. Actual news was occurring.
NPR's media correspondent David Folkenflik has some thoughts on that. And David, this is pretty fish in a barrel, but weigh in. Were you watching or were you at the dinner?
No, I was actually up at my university for events there over the weekend, and so I was actually following through the newer version of cable news, which is Twitter, which was giving live updates from people. I happen to be following a ton of folks who are journalists, and I follow a ton of people from Baltimore because I worked for the Baltimore Sun for over a decade. So in that sense, I was getting a lot of updates from people with interest from a variety of different perspectives that way.
But if you were watching CNN, as I was on occasion, it was disconcerting. You saw people in ball gowns on a red carpet talking about what was going on inside the dinner, and very occasionally saying, oh, and there's unrest in Baltimore. Your thoughts?
Well, the crazy thing about that is it's almost as though it's the Goldilocks problem. Can you get, is the porridge too warm, hot? Is the porridge too cold? And CNN seems to have gotten it wrong in both ways. In the days leading up to Saturday night, when unrest really became violent and you saw a riot, CNN almost seemed to be predicting and anticipating that the protests would turn violent, and the protests were not violent. In fact, a former colleague of mine at the Sun, Michael Hill, who's covered conflict in Africa as a foreign correspondent for that newspaper, he said, okay, you got the riots that you were looking for, CNN. Are you happy now? He's not somebody who usually goes around bashing the media, and yet in this instance, he said there was a hyperbolic nature of the coverage there. Similarly, I saw a clip from a protester yesterday being interviewed by one of MSNBC's anchors, and she said, look, we protested peacefully for 6 days, and really most of the national press didn't pay attention sufficiently to what we were contending about the grievances against police and the use and abuse of authority in this city. And then after violence spills over, after buildings get looted and in a couple of squad cars get burned, at that point you start paying very close attention. Indeed, where are your priorities in the media? And I thought, she raised some pretty valid questions there.
Well, speaking of which, you work for the Baltimore Sun, as you said. They did an extraordinary report in 2014 about police excessive use of force in Baltimore and the money that had been paid out. And in the Atlantic in April, Connor Friedersdorf, who says he writes about media, said he was embarrassed that he hadn't paid attention to anything that was happening in Baltimore until the most recent case.
Well, there's an ongoing narrative and conversation about Baltimore that bubbles up at moments of real contention and then fades away. And that fading away doesn't do Baltimore any favors, because there are institutions and people in Baltimore over time who've tried to tackle questions of entrenched poverty, questions of drug abuse and drug violence and other attendant problems there, but clearly haven't cracked that issue, even as there has been a drop in a significant way in violent crime and homicides, starting with then Mayor Martin O'Malley, who's now the former governor of Maryland and who's running for president on his record in some ways, trying to focus on issues like that. But, those larger societal issues in Baltimore haven't been cracked. Mayors, both black and white, have had real trouble with that. One of the elements of that story from the Baltimore Sun that you mentioned from September 2014, the second sentence of it says, one hidden cost for the payouts of nearly $6 million over the last few years for lawsuits claiming that police officers brazenly beat up alleged suspects. The hidden cost in that second sentence, they say, the perception that officers are violent can poison the relationship between residents and police. And that may sound squishy, that may sound a little bit intangible. At the same time, I think it undergirds the kind of passion and anger that you saw at the protests and that spilled over into the lawlessness that occurred on Saturday night.
And just briefly, David, we just have a few seconds, but to the criticism that the press seemed to be standing around hoping for riots, they're in a tough position perhaps, because if they're not there, then they're accused of not being there to be witness.
I think it's a news story on both ends of it. The question is the tone and the calibration, and in some ways a more finely rendered portrait can be elicited from looking on social media and getting sort of an overview from these little tiles, a mosaic approach to understanding the bigger picture. Things weren't all violent, and yet that lawlessness was, terribly wrong after a terribly violent incident.
We'll take this up again. NPR's David Folkenflik, thanks so much.
You bet.
Support for WBFO comes from our members and from the Buffalo Philharmonic Orchestra, presenting Bond and Beyond, 50 years of 007, on Saturday, May 2nd at 8 p.m. in Kleinhans Music Hall. Broadway songstress Debbie Gravitt joins the BPO to celebrate the music of the film franchise that introduced so many popular songs, Live and Let Die, For Your Eyes Only, Nobody Does It Better, and more. Tickets at 716-885-5000 or bpo.org.
I'm Steve Brown. An overnight curfew will again be in effect tonight in Baltimore, where 3,000 police and National Guardsmen are in place to enforce it. There were no reports of disturbances in the early morning hours today before the curfew ended at 5 a.m. Baltimore was rocked by looting and widespread arson Monday after the funeral for a black man who died from injuries sustained while in police custody. Analysts say there is no chance that the Federal Reserve will raise interest rates anytime soon. In the wake of today's report on first quarter economic growth, the government says the economy grew at a barely detectable rate of 0.2%. Anheuser-Busch is apologizing for a slogan that appeared on bottles of Bud Light. The slogan said that the beer removes the word no from drinkers' vocabulary. The reaction comes amid a national focus on the issue of rape on college campuses. You're listening to Here and Now.
And you're listening to member-supported WBFO. It's 19 minutes past noon. I'm Omar Fatu. Daredevil Nick Wallenda successfully completed a walk across the rim of the 400-foot Orlando Eye observation wheel in Florida this morning. The 36-year-old started his walk shortly after 8 a.m. atop the city's newest attraction, which is set to open to the public early next month. Wallenda rode to the top of the wheel and then navigated up ladders and around sections of the structure before beginning his walk, which lasted only a few minutes. In November, Wallenda made 2 Chicago skyscraper crossings